The letter arrived with a circuit rider, tucked between a notice of auction and a month-old newspaper from Cheyenne. Eli turned it over in his calloused hands. The paper was thin, the cheapest kind, and the address was written in a hand so neat and controlled it seemed afraid to take up space. Mr. Elijah Thorne, Solitude, Wyoming Territory. He waited until the supper dishes were washed and the fire was banked to a steady, hungry glow before he opened it. The wind, a constant companion on this unforgiving slope of the Laramie Mountains, howled at the eaves of the small cabin, a lonely sound for a lonely man. It had been 2 years since he'd buried Martha. 2 years of silence broken only by the lowing of his cattle and the ceaseless complaint of the wind. The silence had finally grown too loud. He'd written the advertisement for a mail-order bride on a night much like this, his pencil blunt, his words plainer than a fence post. Homesteader, 35, seeks a wife. Must be of strong constitution and willing to work. I have 160 acres, a sturdy house, and no debts. I offer an honest name and protection. He'd left out the part about the ache in his chest that never seemed to dull, the crushing weight of a house empty of life. The response he held was just as spare. Mr. Thorne, I have seen your notice. I am 24 years of age, an orphan, and have worked for hire since I was a girl. I am in good health. I can cook, clean, mend, and tend a garden. I am not given to idle chatter. I ask only for a place to live in exchange for my labor. If this is agreeable, I will take the next westbound stagecoach. Sincerely, Clara May Brooks. Eli read it 3 times. There was no hope in the words, no girlish excitement, no questions about his character or his home. It was a contract, a plea for sanctuary disguised as an offer of service. I am not given to idle chatter. That line clung to him. He'd known women who could talk the sun down, fill a room with stories and laughter. Martha had been like that. This Clara May Brooks sounded like a shadow, and yet something in the stark honesty of her letter, the complete absence of pretense, resonated with the quiet, broken places in his own soul. It was a letter from a survivor, and Eli, in his own way, was a survivor too. He folded the thin paper and tucked it into his shirt pocket. The decision made. A woman who asked for nothing more than a place to exist was a woman who understood the harsh currency of the world. He spent the next 2 weeks preparing. The room that had been Martha's sewing room, and then a storage space for things he couldn't bear to throw away, was cleared out. He scrubbed the floors until the pine boards shone, patched a drafty spot by the window, and changed the linens on the small rope bed. He dragged in a simple pine washstand and hung a small, cracked mirror above it. On the bed, he laid one of Martha's finer quilts, a pattern of interlocking stars in shades of faded blue and cream. He stood in the doorway, looking at the clean, sparse room, and wondered if it would be a haven or a cage for the woman who was coming. His ranch was a lonely speck carved out of the wilderness. The cabin and a sturdy barn sat on a high meadow, flanked by aspen groves and granite-strewn hills. It was a beautiful place in the brief, fierce summer, but for most of the year, it was a battleground against wind and snow. The growing season was short, the winters long and brutal. It was no place for a delicate flower. The advertisement had been honest. Strong constitution. He hoped hers was strong enough. The day the stage was due, Eli rode his best gelding, Dusty, into the town of Solitude. The name was fitting. It was little more than a wide spot in the trail with a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a handful of weathered houses. He tied Dusty to the hitching post outside the store and waited on the boardwalk, his hat pulled low against the sharp November wind. The townspeople watched him. They always did. Eli Thorne kept to himself, a man defined by his grief and his land. He was respected for his hard work, but not well known. His quietness made people uneasy. Agnes Miller, the storekeeper's wife, swept her porch with a vigor that was more about listening than cleaning. 2 old-timers playing checkers on a barrel paused their game. When the stagecoach rattled into view, a cloud of dust and steam in the cold air, a knot tightened in Eli's stomach. This was a fool's errand. He thought for a brief, panicked moment, tying himself to a stranger, a woman he knew only from a few stark lines on a piece of paper. The driver, Silas, hauled back on the reins. "Whoa there!" he bellowed, his voice a gravelly roar. The coach groaned to a stop. A drummer in a dusty suit got out, stretched, and headed for the saloon. Then, the door opened again. She emerged not like a bride, but like a prisoner being released into uncertain light. She was dressed in a plain, dark gray traveling dress, worn but clean, with no bustle or lace to soften its severe lines. Her face was pale, unadorned by powder or rouge, and her brown hair was pulled back in a knot so tight it seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes. And her eyes, they were the color of a winter sky, a muted gray blue, and they looked at everything and nothing at all. They were like a window veiled in thick fog. Her posture was ramrod straight, her shoulders braced as if expecting a blow. She carried a single, small carpet bag. "That her Thorn?" Silas grunted, nodding toward the woman. Eli just nodded, stepping off the boardwalk. He heard the whispers behind him before he'd taken 2 steps. It was Agnes Miller, her voice a sharp, carrying hiss. "Lord have mercy. She looks like she's been rode hard and put away wet." Another voice, a man's, joined in. "Got the look of one of them soiled doves from a back alley sporting house, the kind that's seen the rough side of a man's hand too many times." Eli didn't turn. He didn't give them the satisfaction. He walked straight to the woman, his shadow falling over her. He stopped a respectful few feet away. "Miss Brooks?" he asked, his voice low and even. She flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of her entire body, before her eyes focused on his face. They were empty of fear, or hope, or anything he could name. They were just vacant. "Mr. Thorn," she said. Her voice was a surprise, a low, soft thing, yet as devoid of color as her dress. "Welcome to solitude," he said simply. He reached for her bag. "Allow me." Her fingers tightened on the handle for a split second before she released it, her hand snatching back as if his might burn her. Eli pretended not to notice. He loaded her bag onto the back of his supply wagon, helped her up to the seat, and untied Dusty, hitching him to the rear. The entire time, he felt the town's eyes on them, dissecting this strange, silent woman he'd brought to his isolated life. The ride to the ranch was made in near total silence. The wagon wheels groaned in the ruts of the hard-packed earth, and the wind whistled through the pines. Eli pointed out a landmark once. "That's Miller's Ridge. Snowdrifts get 20 feet deep there come January." Clara just gave a short, sharp nod, her gaze fixed on the space between the horse's ears. She sat perfectly still, her hands clenched in her lap. She looked less like a woman arriving at her new home, and more like a captured animal being transported to a new pen, wary and watchful of the bars. When they arrived, he led her into the cabin. The warmth from the stove rushed out to meet them. He saw her shoulders drop by a fraction of an inch, the only sign of relief she'd shown. "Your room is this way," he said, leading her to the small, clean space he'd prepared. She stopped in the doorway, her foggy eyes taking in the simple bed with its colorful quilt, the washstand, the window that looked out onto the vast, empty hills. For the first time, a flicker of something moved in their depths. It wasn't happiness. It was a profound, bone-deep weariness, as if she couldn't believe a place so quiet and empty of threat could be real. "It is sufficient," she whispered, the words barely audible. "The kitchen is through there. The necessary is out back. I'll bring your bag in." He set her bag just inside the door, careful not to cross the threshold, and retreated to give her space. That evening, after a supper of stew and cornbread, eaten in a silence so thick he could feel its weight, she laid out her terms. They sat at opposite ends of the small pine table, the lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. "Sir," she began, her eyes on her folded hands. "Eli," he corrected gently. "My name is Eli." She looked up, and her gaze was unblinking. "If it pleases you, I will call you sir. It is more appropriate." She said the word as if it were a shield. "I will not enter your room, and I would ask that you do not enter mine. I will rise before you and have breakfast ready. I will work until the evening chores are done. I require nothing more than my keep." Eli studied her. This wasn't a bride making requests of her husband. This was an employee setting boundaries with an employer. More than that, it was a list of rules for survival. The walls she was building were high and thick. He understood, in a way he couldn't quite articulate, that to challenge them would be to frighten her away. She needed these walls. "As you wish, Clara," he said with a simple nod. And so their strange life began. Clara was true to her word. She was a ghost in his house, a tireless, silent worker. The cabin had never been cleaner, the meals never more regular. She mended his shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She learned the rhythms of the ranch without ever asking a single question, anticipating his needs with an unnerving prescience. She was there and not there, a physical presence whose spirit remained locked away. He would sometimes watch her from the barn, seeing her scrub the porch steps or hang laundry in the biting wind. Her movements economical and precise. She never sang, never hummed. The silence she carried with her was a heavier thing than the one his own grief had created. He began to notice other things, the way she would startle at the sound of a falling log in the fireplace, the way she always positioned herself in a room with her back to a wall, her eyes on the door. She never, ever let him come up behind her. If he entered a room where she was working, he learned to scuff his boots on the floorboards first, to give her warning. The one time he forgot, he'd come into the kitchen to find her pressing herself into a corner, a carving knife in her hand, her face a mask of pure, primal terror that vanished as soon as she recognized him. She'd said nothing, simply put the knife down and returned to peeling potatoes. But her hands had trembled for an hour afterward. The suspicion that her letter had only hinted at began to take root in his mind. Orphaned. Worked for hire. The words were a flimsy curtain over a dark and terrible stage. The proof came on a bitter afternoon in early December. A sudden squall had blown in from the north, and the temperature plummeted. The horses in the corral, spooked by the wind and the first stinging pellets of sleet, grew agitated. They kicked at the fencing and let out sharp, panicked whinnies, the sound of animal fear, loud and violent. Eli was in the barn, checking the latches. When he heard it, he glanced toward the house, expecting to see Clara at the window. Instead, the cabin door was open, swinging in the wind, and there, in the middle of the yard, stood Clara. She was staring not at the frantic horses, but at the dark line of trees at the edge of the meadow. Her body as rigid as a pillar of ice. The wind tore at her thin dress, whipping her skirts around her legs. But what made Eli's blood run cold was the sight of her feet. She was standing barefoot in the snow that was already beginning to stick to the frozen ground. She hadn't run from the storm. She had run from the noise. The sound of the horse's panic had triggered something in her, sending her fleeing the safety of the house into the coming blizzard. He moved without thinking. He didn't call her name, afraid his voice would shatter whatever trance held her. He walked out of the barn, his steps slow and deliberate. He grabbed his heavy sheepskin coat from a peg by the door as he passed. The wind hit him like a physical blow, but he barely felt it. His eyes were fixed on the small, still figure in the snow. When he reached her, he gently, carefully, wrapped the heavy coat around her thin shoulders. She gasped, a sharp intake of air, and her head whipped around. For a terrifying second, her eyes were wild, unseeing. Then they focused on his face, and the terror receded, replaced by a wave of confusion and a deep, shuddering shame. He said nothing. There were no words for what he was seeing. He simply put a hand on her elbow, his touch as light as he could make it, and guided her back toward the cabin. He could feel the violent tremors running through her body. Inside, he sat her in a chair by the stove and knelt before her. Her feet were blue with cold. Without a word, he fetched a basin of lukewarm water and a rough towel and began to gently wash the snow and dirt from her skin. She sat rigid, her hands clutching the arms of the chair, watching him as if he were a strange creature whose actions she could not comprehend. He dried her feet and wrapped them in a thick wool blanket. He stood, put another log in the stove, and then sat down at the table, picking up a piece of leather he'd been meaning to mend. He worked in silence, giving her time, giving her space. He knew then, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that Clara May Brooks had not come to his ranch from a life of simple hardship. Poverty didn't make a woman run barefoot into a snowstorm to escape the sound of frightened horses. Poverty didn't put that particular kind of hunted look in a woman's eyes. He remembered her letter. "I am not given to idle chatter." He finally understood. She wasn't quiet by nature. She was silent by necessity, because her story was one that could not be told. The wounds she carried were not the kind that showed on the surface, but he had just seen the raw terror they could produce. She was a woman who had survived something far worse than being orphaned, and he, in his blind loneliness, had invited that survival, and whatever haunted it, into his home. The incident with the snow left a new kind of silence in the cabin. It was no longer just the absence of chatter, but a space filled with a question Eli didn't know how to ask, and an answer Clara was unable to give. He watched her more closely after that, not with suspicion, but with the heavy, patient sorrow of a man watching a crippled bird, knowing the slightest wrong move would send it scattering in a panic of broken feathers. He realized she didn't need a husband. She needed a sanctuary. And he, with his calloused hands and quiet ways, was determined to make his land just that. He began to teach her the terrain, not as his property, but as a map to safety. One clear, cold morning, when the sun made the endless snowfields glitter with a light so bright it hurt the eyes, he took her walking. He didn't ask. He simply put on his coat and held hers out to her. To his surprise, she took it and followed him out the door. "This land can be a friend or an enemy," he said, his breath pluming in the air. "Depends on how well you know it." He led her along the fence line, his boots crunching in the snow. "The fence is new, but here." He stopped and kicked at a low spot where the wires sagged near an aspen grove. "A person could slip through quick if they had to. The trees give good cover all the way to the ridge." She said nothing, but her gaze, usually so distant, was sharp and focused. She wasn't looking at the view. She was studying the path, memorizing the lay of the land, the way the trees clustered, the dip and rise of the ground beneath the snow. He took her to the barn. It was his domain, smelling of hay, horse, and cold leather. He showed her how the big front doors could be barred from the inside, a simple but effective defense. Then he led her to the back, to a stall that was used for storing old equipment. He pushed aside a stack of empty grain sacks to reveal a section of the wall where the boards were looser than the rest. "Martha was always afraid of fire," he said, his voice softer when he spoke his late wife's name. "I fixed this for her. One good kick, and these boards will put you out right behind the barn, near the creek bed. In summer, the creek's a clear path down the mountain." He didn't need to say what it was in winter. A frozen, hidden highway. Finally, he took her to the edge of the high meadow, where the trees thinned and the vast, formidable expanse of the mountainside fell away below them. "Wolves," he said, pointing to a set of tracks not far from their own. "They'll come down from the high country when the snow gets deep. They're smart. They'll test your nerve. The worst thing you can do is run. You stand your ground. You make yourself big. You shout. But if you can't," he turned and pointed to a jagged outcrop of granite boulders 50 yards away. "You get to those rocks. They won't follow you into a place with no room to maneuver. You can wait them out there." He had given her a tour of his world, but what he had really given her were keys, escape routes, defenses, a blueprint for survival. She looked from the wolf tracks to the rocks. then back to him. Her lips parted as if to speak, but she said nothing. Instead, she gave him a single, solemn nod. It was more than he'd gotten from her in weeks. It was an acknowledgement, an understanding. The first crack in her icy composure came a week later. Over one of the horses, it was the bay mare, Daisy, a normally placid animal who had somehow managed to catch her flank on a nailhead protruding from her stall. The cut wasn't deep, but it was long and ugly, bleeding sluggishly onto her winter coat. Eli cursed his own carelessness for not seeing the hazard sooner. He led the mare out into the center of the barn to tend to her. As he gathered a bucket of warm water, carbolic soap, and clean rags, he was aware of Clara standing in the doorway, a silent, still figure in the shadows. "It's just a scratch," he said, more to the horse than to her. "But it needs cleaning." Daisy, normally gentle, was skittish with the pain, sidestepping and tossing her head as he approached with the wet cloth. He gentled her with his voice, but she remained tense. He was about to tie her short when Clara moved. She glided out of the shadows and into the lantern light. Stopping a few feet from the horse's head, she didn't speak. She simply held out a hand, palm up. The mare's ears, which had been pinned back, flickered, her wide, dark eyes fixed on the small, outstretched hand. Clara began to hum. It wasn't a tune, just a low, single-note sound from deep in her throat. It was a sound of pure comfort, the kind of sound a mother might make to a frightened child. The mare's head drooped. She took a hesitant step forward and nudged Clara's palm with her soft nose. Clara began to stroke the horse's face, her movements slow and infinitely tender. "There now," she whispered, the first unsolicited words of comfort he had ever heard her speak. "It's all right. No one will harm you here." Eli stood frozen, watching. As Clara soothed the horse, a profound transformation came over her. The rigid posture softened. The haunted look in her eyes was replaced by a focused empathy. This was a side of her he had never seen, a glimpse of the woman buried beneath layers of fear. He stepped forward quietly. "Can you hold her head for me?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, never breaking her rhythmic stroking, her low hum, as Eli gently cleaned the wound. He watched her hands. They were a study in contradictions. Her touch on the horse was exquisitely gentle, yet he could see a fine, persistent tremor in her fingers, a shaking that she could not control. It was as if her body remembered a terror her mind was trying to soothe away. For the first time, he felt a connection to her, a shared purpose in this quiet act of healing. The physical proof of her past came into view on a laundry day. The sun was a rare and welcome visitor, and the air was still enough to hang the washing outside. Clara was at the large wooden basin near the well, her sleeves pushed high up her arms, scrubbing his work shirts on a washboard. Eli was coming back from the woodpile, his arms loaded with split logs. When he saw them, the pale skin of her forearms was a latticework of old scars. They weren't the clean, straight lines of a single accident. They were a chaotic web of silvery white marks, some thin and faded, others wider, puckered things that spoke of deeper, more deliberate damage. They crisscrossed her arms from wrist to elbow. It was a map of a place he never wanted to visit, a testament to a cruelty he could not begin to fathom. He felt a cold, hard rage settle in his gut. It was so sudden and powerful it made him stop in his tracks. He wanted to storm over there, to demand to know who had done this to her, to hunt them down. But he looked at her face. She was focused on her work, her expression placid, closed. To acknowledge the scars would be to tear them open again, to shame her, to send her retreating back into her shell. He turned his head away, his jaw tight, and carried the wood into the house. The image of those marks burned into his mind. That night, the wind returned with a vengeance, shrieking around the corners of the cabin like a lost soul. It was a violent, angry wind, and it found a loose shutter on the main window. banging it against the log wall with a percussive rhythm like a fist hammering on the door. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. The sound woke Eli from a light sleep. He lay there for a moment, listening. But then he heard another sound, a faint scuffling from Clara's room, followed by the soft, desperate squeak of his cabin's front door. He was out of his bed in an instant, pulling on his trousers and grabbing the heavy rifle he kept by the door. His first thought was of an intruder, of the wolves he'd warned her about. He moved through the main room, his bare feet silent on the cold floorboards. The front door was ajar, letting in a swirl of frigid air and snow. She was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced him. He burst outside, his eyes scanning the moonlit, snow-dusted yard. The wind tore at him, but he ignored it. He saw her tracks, small and frantic, leading not towards the trees or the rocks, but straight to the barn. He found her huddled in the hay of an empty stall, the same one where they had tended to the mare. She had her knees drawn up to her chest and her face buried in her arms. Her whole body was shaking with silent, racking sobs. The sound of that shudder hadn't just woken her up, it had broken her. The controlled, silent woman was gone, and in her place was a terrified, weeping girl. Eli's heart broke. He set the rifle down and slowly approached, making sure she could see him. He didn't speak. What could he say? It was just the wind. Words were useless against a terror this deep. He sat down in the hay a few feet away from her, pulling his heavy sheepskin coat from the peg where it hung and draping it over her shaking shoulders. She flinched at the contact but didn't pull away. And so he sat. He just sat there, a silent, unmoving sentinel in the cold, hay-scented dark. He sat through the long hours as the wind howled itself into exhaustion. He sat as her sobs slowly subsided into hitched, painful breaths. He sat until the first pale, gray light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the barn walls. He didn't offer platitudes or easy comfort. He offered his presence. He offered safety. And in the depths of her despair, it was the only thing she could have accepted. 2 days later, Eli sat at the table long after Clara had gone to her room, a pen and paper before him. He wrote to Sergeant Thomas McCabe, a man he'd served with briefly during the last of the Plains Wars, a man who now worked as a scout for the Army out of Fort Laramie and who heard things. He kept the letter vague, careful. He wrote of his concern about the vulnerability of folks in the territory and asked if McCabe had heard any whispers of illicit activities, of men trading in more than just whiskey and guns. He mentioned routes coming up from the south, from Kansas City or beyond. He didn't mention Clara. He didn't have to. He sealed the letter, his mind grim. He was a man who solved his own problems, but this problem was a shadow, and he needed someone to help him find its source. Their life fell back into its strange rhythm, but something had shifted. Clara still cooked for him, leaving his plate on the table before retreating to the kitchen to eat her own meal standing by the stove. The food was always simple, but it was made with a new kind of care. The stews were richer, the bread lighter. It was her only way of speaking, of thanking him for sitting with her in the dark. Then came the storm. It wasn't just wind this time, but a full-blown blizzard that descended from the mountains without warning, erasing the world in a swirling vortex of white. For 2 days, they were trapped in the cabin, the snow piling up against the door and windows. On the second night, the weariness of the past weeks finally caught up to Clara. Eli was reading by the fire when he realized how quiet the cabin had become. He looked up and saw her slumped over the kitchen table, her head resting on her folded arms, fast asleep. A half-peeled potato lay on the table beside her limp hand. He watched her for a long moment. She looked so young, so utterly defenseless. The rules she had laid down, no entering her room, keeping a distance, seemed trivial in the face of her exhaustion. Leaving her to sleep in a drafty chair all night was a cruelty he wasn't capable of. Quietly, he moved to her side. He hesitated for only a second before sliding one arm under her knees and the other around her back, lifting her into his arms. She was shockingly light, as if she were made of nothing more than bird bones and sorrow. She stirred, a faint, troubled murmur escaping her lips, but she didn't wake. He carried her out of the kitchen and into the main room. He wouldn't break his promise to stay out of her bedroom, so he gently laid her down on the worn settee near the fireplace. As he arranged one of Martha's quilts over her, the flickering firelight cast a warm glow across her face, and then he saw it. Just below her jawline, tucked into the delicate hollow of her neck, was a faint, discolored mark. It was an old bruise, yellowed and faded at the edges, the ghost of a blemish that was almost invisible in the daylight. But in the dancing firelight, he could just make out its shape. It wasn't a random mark. It had the distinct, unmistakable shape of a thumbprint, pressed cruelly into her skin. Eli straightened up, a cold dread washing over him, colder than the blizzard raging outside. The scars, the fear, the flight into the snow, it all coalesced around this one terrible mark. It was a sign of ownership, a brand. This wasn't just a story of hardship. This was a story of possession and of a brutal escape. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the storm she was running from had nothing to do with the wind and the snow. Clara woke with a start, the unfamiliar softness of the settee beneath her a disorienting puzzle. The blizzard still raged outside, a muffled, continuous roar. But inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the steady rhythm of a man's breathing. She sat up, the quilt pooling in her lap. Eli was in his chair across the hearth, his head slumped slightly to one side, asleep. He hadn't gone to his bed. He had stayed in the room with her, a silent guardian through the storm. A wave of shame so powerful it was nauseating washed over her. She had let her weakness show. She had fallen asleep, helpless, and he had carried her. He had seen her. She brought a hand to her neck, to the tender spot below her jaw, a reflexive, protective gesture, as if sensing her movement. Eli's eyes opened. They were clear and sober, and they held no judgment, only a deep, quiet sorrow. He didn't mention her sleeping, didn't ask if she was well. He simply rose, stretched the stiffness from his broad shoulders, and put another log on the fire. "The snow has let up some," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But we'll be snowed in for another day. I reckon I'll make coffee." He moved to the stove, his actions deliberate and calm, as he worked the grinder, the scent of coffee beans filling the small cabin. Clara watched him. He had seen her at her most vulnerable in the barn, and now he had seen the mark on her neck. She had waited for the questions, the disgust, the dismissal. None of it had come. Instead, he had given her his coat, his time, his protection. This quiet, steadfast kindness was a more effective key than any brute force. It was unlocking doors inside her that had been rusted shut for years. He brought her a steaming mug. She took it with trembling hands, the warmth seeping into her frozen fingers. She looked into the dark liquid, and the story she had sworn to carry to her grave began to rise in her throat like bile. "My name isn't Clara May Brooks," she said, her voice a raw, cracked whisper. "Not my full name. It was Clara May Stevenson." Eli stopped on his way back to the fire and turned to her. He didn't sit, didn't press, just stood and listened, giving her the space to speak or to fall silent. "We had a farm in Kansas. My parents, the spring wheat was just coming in." She spoke in a monotone, her eyes fixed on a point in the distant past. "They came at dusk. 4 of them. They wanted money, horses. They took them. And then they took me, too. My father tried to stop them." Her voice hitched for a fraction of a second. "They left him in the dirt." Eli's hands, hanging at his sides, slowly curled into fists. A muscle jumped in his jaw, but his face remained a mask of calm. "They sold me in Kansas City," she continued, the words coming faster now, as if to outrun the memories. "To a man who dealt in Property? He put me and 3 other girls on a riverboat, down the Mississippi, all the way to New Orleans." She finally looked at him, her foggy eyes daring him to turn away. "He sold me to a house there, a fancy one, in the French Quarter, all velvet and perfume. They called me Lily. Clara was not a name for a girl like that. The word girl was a bitter stone in her mouth. The woman who ran the place, she said I was lucky, said I was pretty enough to entertain gentlemen, not just any rough drifter with a coin in his pocket. She taught me how to pour brandy, how to smile when I wanted to scream, how to comply." The silence that followed was deafening. Eli could hear the blood pounding in his ears, a hot, furious drumbeat. The rage he'd felt when he saw the scars on her arms was a pale thing compared to the inferno that now consumed him. It was a clean, righteous fury, aimed at the faceless men who had stolen her name, her life, and tried to break her spirit. "For 2 years," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the fire. "Every night, a different man. Some were kind, in their way, quiet, sad. Others enjoyed the fact that I was not there by choice." She touched her neck again. "The man who left this, he was a planter from upriver. He said he liked a filly with spirit, just so he could be the one to break it." Eli took a half-step toward her, his body vibrating with a violence he was struggling to contain. He wanted to smash something, to ride out into the blizzard and not stop until he found the men who did this and rendered them into dust. "How did you get away?" he asked, his voice strained, raw. "He drank too much," she said simply. The planter passed out in his chair. He'd been careless, left the door unlocked. The madam had a rule, the girls were always locked in. But he was important, so no one checked. I took the shoes off my feet and I ran. I ran until the city was behind me and the swamp was all around. I walked north, for days, weeks. I stole food from gardens, slept in barns. I didn't know where I was going, just away, in a small town in Arkansas. I saw your advertisement tacked to a board in the post office. It was a month old. It asked for so little. An honest name. Protection. She finally fell silent. The story was told. It lay in the space between them, a wounded, ugly thing. She didn't cry. Her eyes were wide and dry, as if she had no tears left to shed. She watched him, her body braced for the verdict. Eli walked over to her then. He knelt on the floor in front of the settee, so their eyes were level. His face was etched with a pain that mirrored her own. He saw the shame and fear warring in her gaze, the expectation of being thrown out, of being seen as sullied, ruined. He reached out, not to touch her, but just to hover his large, calloused hand near her arm, a gesture of intent. His voice, when he spoke, was thick with emotion, but absolutely steady. "Clara," he said, using her real name, her chosen name. "What those men did to you, that is their sin, their filth. It does not touch you. Do you hear me? It does not touch you." He saw the first crack in her desolate composure. Her lower lip trembled. He leaned in, his gaze burning with an intensity that seemed to pour strength directly into her. "My name is Eli Thorne, and on this land, under my roof, no one will ever hurt you again. That is my promise." She finally broke. A single crystalline tear traced a path down her pale cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but of release. But her fear was not gone. It was a creature with deep roots. "What if they find me?" she whispered. The question was a ghost that had haunted every step of her journey. The planter, the madam, they were not people who would take the loss of valuable property lightly. "They'll have men looking. The law would be on their side." Eli's jaw hardened into a line of pure granite. He thought of the lawmen he knew, men who followed the letter of a contract, who saw the world in terms of property and ownership. He thought of how easily a woman like Clara could be dismissed, her story disbelieved, her fate sealed by a man with a bill of sale. "Then to hell with the law," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. This is my land. You are my wife. No piece of paper from a New Orleans whorehouse means a damn thing here. If any man comes to this door looking for a girl named Lily, he'll meet a man named Thorn, and only one of us will be walking away." It was a vow, sworn in the heart of a blizzard, witnessed only by the dancing flames. It was more binding than any preacher's words in a church. He was her shield, her fortress. And in that moment, something new was forged between them, something stronger than pity and more profound than need. It was the beginning of trust. The blizzard broke the next day, leaving a world of pristine, sculpted silence. The change in the weather was mirrored by a change in the cabin. That evening, when Clara brought Eli's dinner to the table, he had already set a second place, opposite his own. "Sit, Clara," he said. It was not a request. He ladled stew into her bowl himself. She hesitated for only a moment before sliding into the chair. They ate in silence, as they always had, but it was a different silence. It was no longer a wall between them, but a space they shared. She no longer kept her eyes downcast, fixed on her plate. A few times, she looked up, and her gaze met his across the table. His eyes were steady, calm, reassuring. The fog in hers seemed to be thinning, just a little. A few nights later, a small, momentous event occurred. She had forgotten to put the salt on the table. When he gestured for it, she fetched the small cellar and passed it to him. As he took it, his fingers brushed against hers. His skin was rough, calloused from work. Hers was soft. It was the first time they had touched by choice, however fleetingly. A jolt, like a tiny spark of static, passed between them. She tensed, her instinct to pull back warring with a new, unfamiliar impulse to stay. She held her ground. She did not pull her hand away. Eli's eyes met hers for a long second, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them, before he drew the salt cellar from her grasp. Outside, the Wyoming winter held the land in its merciless grip. The trees stood like blackened skeletons against the endless white of the snow. The wind, when it blew, was sharp as a razor, and the stars in the night sky were cold, distant diamonds of ice. It was a stark, lonely, unforgiving landscape, a world stripped bare of all softness. But inside the small log cabin on the side of the hill, something had begun to thaw. Each evening, the fire in the hearth seemed to burn a little brighter. The small circle of light it cast pushed the shadows further into the corners. The two solitary figures who sat within its warmth were still quiet, still wounded, but they were no longer entirely alone. They were two broken pieces, beginning to learn that they might fit together, creating a fragile shelter against the cold. The thaw was a slow, cautious thing, both inside the cabin and out. As the days lengthened and the iron grip of winter loosened its hold, patches of bare earth appeared on the sun-facing slopes. In the evenings, Eli and Clara would sit at the table, the silence between them now comfortable, companionable. He would mend a piece of tack, and she would darn a sock. The rhythmic scrape of his knife and the soft pull of her thread weaving a new kind of domestic peace. But they both knew peace was a fragile commodity, easily broken. The news came from Solitude, carried back with a sack of flour and a block of salt. It arrived in the form of a strange man. Eli had ridden into town for supplies, leaving Clara with the rifle propped by the door and a promise to be back before dusk. As he was loading his wagon, Agnes Miller, the owner of the fabric emporium and the town's chief purveyor of gossip, cornered him by the water trough. Her face was a mixture of smug curiosity and feigned concern. "Elijah," she began, her voice a confidential whisper that carried across the street. "A stranger came through on yesterday's stage, a city man, dressed in a fancy suit and asking peculiar questions." Eli continued tying down his load, his movements unhurried. "Town gets its share of strangers. Agnes." "Not like this one," she pressed, her small, dark eyes glittering. "He was asking about a runaway, a young woman. He described her as, well, he used a rather coarse term for a girl from a New Orleans sporting house. She paused for effect, watching his face. Said she had brown hair and quiet ways, stole something valuable from her employer and fled north. Eli finished his knot, pulling it brutally tight. He turned to face her, his expression as hard and unreadable as granite. And this is my concern. How? Agnes's smile faltered slightly under his cold gaze. Well, people are talking. Elijah, you showing up with that bride of yours. Her looking like a half-starved stray and never speaking a word to anyone. It does make one wonder. Eli straightened to his full height, his shadow falling over her. Let them wonder, he said, his voice low and flat. My wife's past is her own, and my business is my own. I'd advise you and the rest of them to remember that. He climbed onto the wagon seat without another word and drove away, the heat of the town's collective stare burning on his back. The stranger's questions were a stone tossed into the quiet pond of their life, and the ripples spread quickly. The looks he and Clara received on their infrequent trips to town changed from simple curiosity to something colder, more judgmental. Whispers followed them from the general store to the blacksmith's. Runaway. Stole something. The man is looking for her. The town, which had merely seen Clara as a strange, silent woman, now had a story for her. A sordid, ugly narrative that fit their preconceived notions. They had convicted her without a trial. Eli didn't tell Clara about the stranger at first, but she knew something had changed. She saw it in the new tension in his shoulders, in the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon. She saw it in the work he began that very next day. He started with the fences, replacing old posts, tightening wires until they hummed in the wind. Then he turned his attention to the old root cellar, a stone-lined pit dug into the hillside 100 yards from the cabin, its entrance hidden by a thicket of wild-growing choke cherry bushes. He spent 2 days clearing it out, shoring up the timbers, and building a new, heavy door that could be barred from the inside. He ran a hidden pipe from a nearby spring for water and stocked the small space with dried meat, hardtack, and blankets. When he was finished, he took Clara there. He pushed aside the branches to reveal the low door. If anyone ever comes, he said, his voice grim. Anyone you don't know, and I'm not here. You come here. You bar the door, and you don't make a sound. You wait for me. Clara stared into the dark, earthy-smelling space. It was a tomb, a hiding place. The necessity of it was a cold confirmation of her deepest fears. They had found her scent. The hunter was closing in. That evening, he laid his Colt revolver and his Winchester rifle on the kitchen table. The firelight glinted off the oiled metal. You need to learn, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I can't be everywhere at once. You need to be able to protect yourself. Her hands started to tremble. She looked at the guns as if they were venomous snakes. A gun was the tool of the men who had taken her, the instrument of her father's death. It was a symbol of everything she feared. I can't, Eli. You can, he said, his voice softening but losing none of its resolve. Fear is a choice. Clara, right now, it's a luxury we can't afford. The men who are looking for you won't be carrying Bibles. He took her out behind the barn the next day, setting up old tins on a fence post. He started with the rifle, showing her how to hold it firm against her shoulder, how to sight down the long barrel, how to breathe out slow before squeezing the trigger. The first time she fired, the recoil slammed the stock into her shoulder, a brutal, punishing blow. The sound was a deafening crack that echoed off the mountains, and she flinched so hard she nearly dropped the weapon. She missed the tin by a yard. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and failure. He simply took the rifle, reloaded it, and handed it back to her. Again, day after day. He made her practice. Her shoulder ached and turned a mottled purple-blue. Her hands shook every time she picked up the cold, heavy steel. Each blast was a physical assault, bringing back the sound of the gunshot in the Kansas dusk. But she did not refuse. She saw the grim determination in Eli's eyes, and she understood. This was not an act of aggression. It was an act of survival. It was his way of giving her a piece of his own strength. Slowly, painstakingly, her trembling lessened. She learned to control her breathing, and one afternoon, a tin can flew off the fence post with a satisfying ping. A small, fierce look of triumph flickered in her eyes before being quickly extinguished. She had learned to wield the thing she hated most. The shared threat, the secret preparations, the grim lessons with the rifle. They forged a new, deeper intimacy between them. The careful distance they had maintained began to dissolve. In the evenings, they started to talk. It began with simple things. The weather, the cattle. But slowly, they began to share pieces of themselves. He told her about Martha. Not just that she had died, but how it had been a fever that came on fast and burned hot, leaving her weak and delirious. He spoke of the helplessness of watching the woman he loved fade away before his eyes, of the town doctor's useless tonics, of the long, lonely ride to fetch ice from the high mountain lakes, only to return and find her gone. "The silence," he said one night, staring into the flames, his voice rough. "That was the worst part. The day after I buried her, I came back to this cabin, and the silence was so loud it was like a scream. I thought it would drive me mad." He looked over at Clara, her head bent over her mending. I hadn't realized how much space her voice, her laughter, had filled. Without it, the whole world felt empty. His confession was a gift, a piece of his own brokenness offered to her. A few nights later, she gave him a piece of hers in return. She told him about her mother, about the quilts she used to make, how she could name every wildflower that grew on the Kansas prairie. She spoke of her father's hands, how they were big and rough like Eli's, but could be so gentle when he was showing her how to plant a seed. She spoke of a life that had been simple and full of light before the darkness came and swallowed it whole. They were two survivors, mapping out the landscapes of their grief for each other, finding common ground in the territory of loss. The looks that passed between them over the dinner table were no longer just soft. They were filled with a profound, aching understanding. The breaking point came on a moonless night, with a storm brewing in the west. The air was heavy and electric, and a cold rain had begun to fall, tapping insistently on the roof. Eli was oiling the rifle when he heard it, the distinct, unmistakable sound of hoofbeats, coming up the trail at a fast trot. It wasn't the slow, plodding gait of one of his own wandering cattle. It was a rider. He saw the change in Clara instantly. She froze, her needle poised over a shirt. All the color drained from her face. The hunted look was back in her eyes, sharper and more desperate than ever before. This was it. The ghost had taken form. "Get to the cellar," Eli said, his voice a low, urgent command as he rose and grabbed the Winchester. But Clara didn't move. She stared at him, her eyes wide with a new kind of terror. It wasn't just for herself anymore. It was for him. She saw him standing there, rifle in hand, ready to place himself between her and the approaching danger. She saw the planter from New Orleans, his cruel face and his loaded pistol. She saw Eli falling in the dirt, just like her father. Before he could react, she moved. She darted past him, threw open the cabin door, and ran out into the night and the driving rain. She wasn't running to the cellar. She was running away, trying to draw the danger away from him, to sacrifice herself to save him. "Clara!" he roared, a sound of pure fury and fear. He didn't hesitate. He tore out of the cabin after her, leaving the door swinging in the wind. The rain was coming down hard now, cold and blinding. He could just make out her dark shape ahead of him, a fleeting shadow against the night. He was faster. He caught up to her at the edge of the aspen grove, grabbing her arm and spinning her around to face him. "What in God's name are you doing?" he yelled, his hands gripping her shoulders, the rain plastering her thin dress to her body and streaming down his face. "Let me go!" she cried, struggling against his grip. It's me they want, not you. We're in this together. I gave you my word, he shouted back, the wind and rain trying to tear the words from his mouth. Your word doesn't stop a bullet, she screamed, her voice breaking with anguish. Her fight suddenly went out of her, and she sagged in his arms, her face buried in his wet shirt. I won't see you die for me. Eli, I won't. I'd rather go back than see that happen. The admission, spoken into the heart of the storm, struck him with the force of a physical blow. She loved him. It was a love born of shared trauma and quiet kindness, a love that had grown in the silent spaces between them, and it was a love so fierce it was willing to destroy itself to protect its object. He pulled her back, his hands framing her face, forcing her to look at him. The rain ran in rivulets through her hair and down her cheeks, mingling with the tears she no longer tried to hide. His eyes, even in the darkness, burned with a desperate, consuming fire. Listen to me, he said, his voice dropping to a raw, intense whisper that was more powerful than any shout. That life I had before you came, the silence, the emptiness, that was a kind of death. Clara, I was just a ghost, walking through the motions. He leaned his forehead against hers, the cold rain forgotten. The world narrowed to the space between their two faces. If I live without you, he breathed, the words a sacred vow torn from the deepest part of his soul. Then I'm already dead. And then, from down the trail, a voice called out, friendly and familiar. Eli, you home? My wagon threw a wheel down by the creek. It was Silas, the stagecoach driver. Not a threat, not a hunter, just a neighbor in need of help. The tension broke, but the words Eli had spoken hung in the air, irrevocable and true. He hadn't just offered her protection. He had offered her his very life, making it clear that without her, it had no meaning at all. The false alarm with Silas, the stagecoach driver, left an indelible mark. Eli's whispered confession in the rain, if I live without you, then I'm already dead, was a truth that could not be unspoken. It settled between them, displacing the last remnants of fear and replacing them with a fragile, powerful certainty. The dynamic had shifted. He was no longer just her protector, and she was no longer just a survivor. They were two halves of a whole, bound together by a vow made in a storm. The proof of this new reality came not in words, but in a quiet, desperate moment in the barn. One of his heifers, a young first-timer, had gone into labor too soon. The calf was coming wrong. A breech birth that was a death sentence for both mother and child if left alone. 4 hours. Eli fought, his arms slick with sweat and blood, the panicked, lowing cries of the cow echoing in the lantern-lit space. Clara was at his side, her face pale but her hands steady, passing him rags, bringing warm water. Her presence a silent, unwavering support. Finally, with one last, desperate effort, he managed to turn the calf and pull it free. It slumped to the hay-strewn floor, a tiny, motionless heap, too small, too still. Eli's shoulders slumped in defeat. It's no use, he breathed, exhausted. It's not breathing. But Clara fell to her knees beside the tiny creature. She had seen this once as a child, a lamb born lifeless on a cold spring morning. Without hesitation, she cleared the fluid from the calf's nose and mouth with her fingers. Then, she began to rub its small body, her hands working with a fierce, desperate energy, using handfuls of rough hay to stimulate the skin, to shock the life back into it. Come on, she whispered, her voice a raw, pleading prayer. Oh, please, come on, breathe, just breathe. Eli watched, transfixed. He saw not a broken woman, but a warrior, fighting for a single, precious life against the overwhelming odds of death. He saw the fire in her, the unyielding core of strength that had allowed her to survive the unspeakable. And he was filled with a wave of love so powerful it left him breathless. A tiny gasp, a shuddering intake of air. The calf's ribs expanded, then contracted. It was alive. Clara sank back on her heels, her hand still resting on the calf's damp hide, a single tear of relief tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. She looked up at Eli, her eyes shining in the lantern light, and in them he saw not just survival, but triumph. He moved toward her, his heart aching with a tenderness he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. He knelt in the hay in front of her, the scent of earth and life and birth all around them. He reached out and gently wiped the tear from her cheek with his thumb. Her skin was soft beneath his calloused touch. He didn't plan it. The impulse was as natural as breathing. He leaned in and pressed his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of reverence. It was chaste, gentle, tasting of salt and relief. She stiffened for a single, terrified heartbeat, a ghost of her past rising within her. But then, as he began to pull away, believing he had trespassed, she made a small sound in her throat and leaned into him, her lips softening under his. It was a kiss of acceptance, a tentative, fragile yes in a world that had taught her to always say no. A week later, they rode out to check the fence line in the high pasture. The weather had turned, a false spring that had melted much of the snow and brought a deceptive warmth to the air. But in the mountains, the weather was a fickle beast. As they reached the farthest edge of his property, the sky turned a bruised, leaden gray, and the wind began to whip with a sudden, vicious cold. Within minutes, the air was thick with snow, a blinding, disorienting blizzard that had swept down from the peaks with no warning. "The line shack!" Eli yelled over the roar of the wind. "It's our only chance." He grabbed the reins of her horse and led them through the swirling whiteout toward a small, dark shape he knew was huddled against a rock outcropping. The line shack was a primitive thing, barely 10 feet square, built of rough-hewn logs and chinked with mud. It was meant for emergencies, a Spartan shelter against the elements. They stumbled inside, pushing the heavy plank doors shut against the storm's fury. The inside was frigid, dark, and smelled of wood smoke and pack rats. There was a small stone fireplace, a crude bunk built into the wall, and little else. The world outside vanished, replaced by the howling of the wind and the claustrophobic intimacy of the tiny room. Eli worked quickly, his hands sure and practiced. He found a small stash of dry kindling and a few split logs left by the last rider who had taken shelter there. Soon, a small, sputtering fire was fighting against the encroaching cold, but the wood was sparse, and the wind found every crack in the old cabin's walls, sending icy drafts across the floor. The temperature was dropping fast. By nightfall, the fire was little more than a pile of glowing embers, and the cold was a living entity, seeping into their bones. They huddled together on the bunk, wrapped in the 2 thin, musty wool blankets they'd found. It wasn't enough. Eli could feel Clara shivering beside him, a fine, uncontrollable trembling. "You're colder than I am," she whispered, her teeth chattering. Before he could protest, she was shrugging out of her heavy sheepskin-lined coat, the one he had insisted she wear. "Clara, no!" "You're bigger," she said, her voice firm. "You'll lose heat faster. Take it." She draped the coat over his shoulders. It was a simple act, but it was a profound reversal. For the first time, she was the one protecting him. He pulled the blankets tighter around them, drawing her close until her back was pressed against his chest. It was no longer a choice, but a necessity. Survival. He wrapped his arms around her, trying to share his body's warmth, his chin resting on the top of her head. She was still trembling, but less violently now. In the near darkness, with the storm raging outside, they were 2 small points of warmth in a vast, frozen world. His hand lay on her back, over the thin fabric of her dress. As he shifted his position, his fingers brushed against a ridge of raised skin just below her shoulder blade. He froze. He had seen the scars on her arms, but these were different. He gently, tentatively, traced the line. It was long, and the skin was puckered and hard. A lash mark. There were others. crisscrossing her back in a hidden, terrible pattern. This was the landscape of her pain, the story written on her skin. He felt her go rigid in his arms. She was holding her breath, waiting for his revulsion, for him to pull his hand away in disgust. He did the opposite. He flattened his palm against her back, a gesture of warmth and acceptance, and held it there, covering the scars with his hand as if to shield them from the cold. He said nothing. Words were useless here. He just let his touch speak for him, offering comfort without pity, acknowledging her wounds without judgment. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind. Then her voice came, a whisper so quiet it was almost a thought. "Do you still want me?" The question was a blade, honed by years of shame and self-loathing. It was the voice of the woman who had been made to feel worthless, damaged beyond repair. Knowing this, feeling this, can you still want what's left of me? Eli tightened his embrace, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. He pressed his lips to her hair, his answer a low, fervent whisper against her ear. "Clara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that transcended simple desire. "I only want you when you want yourself." He was not claiming her. He was liberating her. He was telling her that her own worth, her own healing, was the only thing that mattered. His desire was secondary to her wholeness. It was the most profound declaration of love he could have made. A shudder went through her, but it was not from the cold. It was a deep, seismic tremor, the breaking of chains that had bound her for years. She turned in his arms, her face buried in the rough wool of his shirt. And for the second time since he had known her, she wept. But these were not the silent, desperate tears of the barn. These were tears of catharsis, of a pain so deep it could only be washed away by a love so absolute. He held her, murmuring her name, until the storm inside her finally passed, leaving a quiet, peaceful exhaustion in its wake. They did not sleep, but drifted in that space between. Their shared breath and body heat a fortress against the cold and all the ghosts of the past. They returned to the ranch 2 days later, hollow-eyed and weary, but fundamentally changed. The ordeal in the line shack had not broken them. It had fused them together. The following Sunday, they rode into town. As they tied their horses to the hitching post outside the general store, Agnes Miller and her circle of gossips watched from the boardwalk, their eyes sharp with judgment. Eli felt the familiar tightening in his gut, the instinct to shield Clara from their venomous stares. But as he turned to help her down, Clara did something she had never done before. She slid down from her horse, walked straight to his side, and slipped her small hand into his large one, her fingers lacing with his. It was a simple, quiet gesture, but it was a declaration of war, in the face of the town's scorn. She was claiming her place, not behind him, but beside him. A wave of stunned silence fell over the boardwalk. Agnes Miller's jaw literally dropped. Clara squeezed his hand, her chin held high. Eli looked down at her, a slow, proud smile spreading across his face. Together, they walked into the store, a united front against the world. That evening, a rider from the next county over stopped at the ranch. He was carrying the mail, as the regular circuit rider was down with a fever. He handed Eli a small bundle of letters, among them one addressed not to him, but to Sheriff Judd Tolliver, Solitude, Wyoming Territory. "Judd asked if I saw you to give this to you," the rider explained. "Save me a trip into town. He said it was from some fancy fellow who passed through last month." Eli's blood went cold. He thanked the man and waited until he had ridden out of sight before looking at the envelope. The handwriting was elegant, precise, the script of an educated man. The return address was a hotel in Cheyenne. He knew, with a sickening certainty, who it was from. His promise to Clara, his vow to protect her, warred with his respect for the law. The war was short. He slit the envelope open with his thumb. The letter was brief and arrogant. Sheriff Tolliver, Per our previous conversation, this letter serves as my formal notice. The piece of property we discussed, a runaway girl who calls herself Clara but is legally known as Lily, is currently being harbored by one of your local ranchers, Elijah Thorne. I hold a legal and binding bill of sale for the girl, a copy of which can be furnished upon my arrival. I expect you to uphold the laws of this territory. Have her ready for my collection within the week. Your cooperation will be generously rewarded. Sincerely, Martin Beauclair. Eli read the name 3 times. Martin Beauclair, the planter from upriver, the man who had left his mark on Clara's neck. The ghost now had a name, a claim, and the law on his side. He was no longer a distant threat. He was coming. Eli did not burn the letter. He folded it carefully and placed it on the mantelpiece, a paper declaration of war. He looked at Clara, who was watching him from the kitchen table, her eyes wide with a fear he now recognized and understood. He didn't try to shield her from the truth. The time for that was long past. "His name is Martin Beauclair," Eli said, his voice a low, steady thing that belied the fury churning in his gut. "He's in Cheyenne. He's written to Sheriff Tolliver, demanding his property back." Clara flinched as if struck. The word property was a brand, and for a moment, the old, hunted look returned to her eyes. But then she looked at Eli, at the grim set of his jaw and the unwavering resolve in his gaze, and the fear was replaced by a deep, weary sorrow. The ghost had a name. The fight was no longer a shadow on the horizon. It was at their door. It arrived 2 days later in the form of Sheriff Judd Tolliver and his lanky, nervous deputy. They rode into the yard at mid-morning, the weak spring sun doing little to warm the cold purpose of their visit. Eli met them on the porch, his stance relaxed, but his hand never far from the Colt holstered at his hip. Clara stood just inside the doorway, a silent, pale figure. "Mornin', Eli," the sheriff said, avoiding his eyes. Judd was a man who preferred a quiet life, and he looked deeply uncomfortable with the task before him. "Got some official business." "I expect you do," Eli replied, his voice flat. Mr. Beauclair has filed a legal claim," Judd said, pulling a folded document from his coat. "A writ for the return of runaway property. Says he has a bill of sale under territorial law." "Eli, my hands are tied. I need you to hand the woman over." The words, spoken so plainly in the clear mountain air, were an obscenity. Before Eli could answer, the cabin door opened wider. Clara stepped out onto the porch. Her face was as white as the remaining patches of snow on the high peaks, but her back was straight. She looked not at Eli, but at the sheriff. Her decision was made. She had run from Beauclair once to save her own life. She would not let another man die trying to save it for her. "I will go with you," she said, her voice clear and steady, though it cost her everything to say it. "There is no need for trouble." She took a step forward, toward the porch steps, toward surrender, but she didn't get far. Eli moved, placing himself squarely in her path, a human wall between her and the law. He didn't even look at the sheriff. His eyes were locked on Clara's, and in them, she saw the promise he had made her in the rain, burning bright and fierce. He then turned his head, his gaze sweeping over the 2 lawmen with cold, dismissive authority. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried the weight of an ironclad vow. "This is my land. She is my wife, and this is her home." He took a half step back, bringing him shoulder to shoulder with Clara, a unified front. "You are not welcome here, Judd, and you will not be taking her. Not today, not ever." Sheriff Tolliver's face reddened. He was not a brave man, and the look in Eli's eyes was one he had no desire to challenge. "Don't be a fool, Thorne. You'll be an outlaw. He's got the law on his side." "Then the law is wrong," Eli stated, as if it were the simplest fact in the world. "Now get off my property." The deputy shifted his weight, his hand hovering near his gun, but a sharp look from the sheriff stopped him. Judd knew Eli Thorne. He was a quiet man, but not a man to be trifled with. He would die on this porch before he backed down. Defeated for the moment, the sheriff wheeled his horse around. "You've been warned. Thorne, you bring her to town by noon tomorrow. The circuit judge is in town. We'll settle it there. If you don't show, I'll come back with a posse." The next day, they rode into solitude not as homesteaders, but as prisoners on their way to trial. Clara sat beside Eli on the wagon seat, her hand holding his in a grip that was surprisingly strong. As they drove down the main street, the townspeople emerged from their shops and homes to watch. It was a spectacle. Faces peered from behind curtains. Men stopped their conversations to stare. Their support and their condemnation was plain to see. Agnes Miller stood on the boardwalk with a smug, vindicated look on her face. Others, however, looked on with grim sympathy. Silas, the stagecoach driver, gave Eli a solemn nod. The blacksmith, a burly man named Gus, wiped his hands on his apron and watched with a thunderous expression, his loyalty clear. The town was a hung jury. Waiting for them in front of the sheriff's office was Martin Beauclair. He was dressed in a fine wool suit and a derby hat, a stark contrast to the rough-spun clothes of the locals. He looked rested, confident, a man entirely sure of his position. When he saw Clara, a cruel, possessive smile touched his lips. It was a smile of ownership, and it made Eli's blood boil. "Lily, my dear," Beauclair said, his voice smooth and condescending. "Did you really think you could hide in a place like this? It's time to come home. You've caused quite enough trouble." He stepped forward, his hand outstretched, intending to grab Clara's arm and pull her from the wagon. It was his final, fatal miscalculation. He underestimated the man sitting beside her. Eli moved so fast it was a blur. He was off the wagon and on Beauclair in 2 long strides. There was no warning, no shouted threat. There was only the sharp, solid crack of knuckles meeting jaw. It was a single, brutally efficient punch, delivered with all the contained rage of the past months. Beauclair's head snapped back, his eyes rolling up, and he crumpled to the dusty street in an undignified heap, out cold before he hit the ground. Stunned silence. Then the deputy was drawing his gun, shouting, "Thorne, you're under arrest for assault!" "He touched my wife," Eli growled, standing over Beauclair's unconscious form, his chest heaving. "He's lucky to be breathing." The assault forced the issue into the open. The makeshift trial was convened an hour later in the saloon, the only building large enough to hold the crush of curious townspeople. Barrels were upended for seats, and Judge Alistair Blackwood, a stern, gray-bearded man with eyes that seemed to miss nothing, took his seat behind the long, scarred bar. Beauclair, now sporting a swollen, purple jaw, presented his case first. He spoke with the articulate, unshakable arrogance of a man who believed the world was built to serve him. He presented his bill of sale, a legal document from New Orleans, with a flourish. "Your Honor," he began, "the matter is simple. This girl," he gestured to Clara, who sat beside Eli, "is my property, purchased legally for a considerable sum. She is a runaway and a thief, having stolen clothes and money to fund her escape. The law is explicit on matters of property. I am here merely to reclaim what is mine." He painted a picture of a benevolent master and a wicked, ungrateful servant. He never looked at Clara as a person, only as an object, a thing to be retrieved. When he was finished, the judge turned his cool, steady gaze on Eli. "Mr. Thorne, your response?" Eli rose. He was not an eloquent man. He did not have fancy words or legal documents. All he had was the truth. He looked not at the judge, but at the faces of his neighbors, Agnes, Silas, Gus, and all the others. He was speaking to them as much as to the court. "Your Honor," he started, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the crowded room. "Mr. Beauclair speaks of property. I want to speak about a woman. Her name is Clara May Stevenson. She was born on a farm in Kansas, to a mother who loved wildflowers and a father who taught her how to plant a garden. He told them everything. He told them of the raid at dusk, of Clara's father being murdered in his own yard. He told them of her being kidnapped, sold like livestock in Kansas City, and shipped down the river on a boat. He didn't spare them the details of the house in New Orleans where she was given a new name and forced to entertain gentlemen. A shocked murmur went through the crowd. Agnes Miller had the decency to look ashamed. Mr. Beauclair claims she is a thief, Eli continued, his voice growing harder, his eyes finding the furious gaze of the planter. She fled that place with nothing but the dress on her back and the shoes on her feet, which she took off so she could run without making a sound. She walked for weeks, sleeping in ditches and stealing turnips from fields to stay alive, until she found her way here, to a new life. He pointed to Beauclair. This man doesn't want property back. He wants a toy he can break. He speaks of a bill of sale. I ask you to look at my wife. Look at the scars on her arms. I invite Mr. Beauclair to explain the old, faded bruise on her neck that has the exact shape of his thumb. I invite him to explain the lash marks on her back. Clara gasped softly, her hand flying to her neck. Eli had never spoken of those marks to her, but he had seen them, had known. This is not a matter of property, Your Honor. Eli finished, his voice ringing with conviction. It is a matter of a human soul. You must decide if a piece of paper signed in a city of sin gives one man the right to own another. You must decide if that is the law in Wyoming, if that is the law in America. He sat down. The saloon was utterly silent. Judge Blackwood stared at the bill of sale in his hand, then at Clara, who sat pale and trembling, but with her head held high. He looked at Beauclair's sputtering rage and at Eli's steadfast defense. Mr. Beauclair, the judge said, his voice a low rumble. This document, this bill of sale, it is indeed a contract for the purchase of a human being. Under some old territorial statutes and laws of commerce, one could argue you have a claim. Beauclair's swollen face broke into a triumphant smirk. Eli's heart sank. However, the judge continued, his voice rising, cutting through the tension. A war was fought in this country not so long ago. A war that cost more than 500,000 lives. That war was fought over the very question that sits before this court today, whether one man can own another. The outcome of that war was not ambiguous. He lifted his gaze to the crowd. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States of America abolished slavery and involuntary servitude. It does not make exceptions for fancy contracts from New Orleans. It does not distinguish between people of one color or another. It says, simply, that in this nation, a human being cannot be property. He looked directly at Beauclair, his eyes like chips of ice. This document, he said, holding up the bill of sale, is an artifact of a barbaric and defeated ideology. It has no legal standing. It is worthless. He then tore the document in half, and then in half again, letting the pieces flutter onto the floor. As for you, Clara May Stevenson Thorne, he said, his voice softening as he looked at her, this court declares you to be what you have always been, a free woman. You are free to live with your husband, on your own land, under the protection of the laws of the United States. Case dismissed. A stunned silence, and then the saloon erupted. A cheer went up from Gus and Silas and a dozen other men. Beauclair, his face a mask of purple fury, stormed out, pushing people aside. Eli turned to Clara. The tension of the past years seemed to drain from her in a single, shuddering breath. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. He reached out and took her hand. It was over. She was free. They walked out of the saloon and into the thin, bright sunlight, hand in hand. The town of Solitude watched them, their faces a mixture of awe, respect, and for a few, like Agnes Miller, disgruntled silence. They had witnessed not just the freeing of a woman, but the triumph of a love that had refused to bow to a cruel and outdated law. Before they could get to their wagon, Judge Blackwood intercepted them, his stern face softened by a look of profound respect. Mr. and Mrs. Thorne, he said, the title now an undisputed fact. I believe there is one more piece of paperwork to finalize. He produced their original mail-order bride contract and, right there on the boardwalk, crossed out the cold, transactional language. In its place, he wrote the simple, legal language of a marriage certificate and signed it with a flourish, his official seal making it ironclad. May your life together be as strong as your character. They had been made husband and wife by a desperate letter and a quiet understanding. Now, they were husband and wife by the highest law of the land. But a legal document felt insufficient for a bond forged in such fire. A few weeks later, when the first wild lupine and Indian paintbrush began to color the high meadows, they held their own ceremony. It was a simple affair, on a windswept bluff that overlooked their small ranch. Their only guests were the few who had stood by them, Gus the blacksmith and his stout, kind-hearted wife, Mary, Silas the stagecoach driver, and Judge Blackwood, who had delayed his departure for the sole purpose of attending. Clara wore a simple cream-colored dress she had sewn herself, and in her hair, she had woven the purple and blue wildflowers that grew in abundance around them. Eli wore his Sunday best, looking uncomfortable but proud, his eyes never leaving her face. There was no preacher, no holy book. Their vows were the story of their life together, spoken plainly under the vast Wyoming sky. I was a broken man in a silent house, Eli said, his voice thick with emotion as he faced her. You came here seeking sanctuary, but it was you who saved me. Clara, you brought life back to this land and back to me. You are the strongest, bravest person I have ever known. My heart is yours. My home is yours. My life is yours. Always. When it was her turn, Clara's voice was a soft, clear whisper that carried on the wind. I came here with nothing but the clothes on my back and a history I was desperate to forget. I thought I was a ghost. You looked at me and saw a person. You taught me how to be safe. You taught me how to be brave. You taught me how to live again. She reached out and took his hands in hers. You are my safety. You are my home. I love you, Eli. Eli had no gold or silver to give her. Instead, he pulled a small, braided ring from his pocket. He had made it himself from a thin, supple strip of leather cut from the reins of the saddle he'd had since he was a boy. The same leather that had carried him through loneliness, grief, and hardship. It was a piece of his own history, his own journey, now braided into an unbreakable circle. It isn't fancy, he said, his hands trembling slightly as he slipped it onto her finger. But it's strong, and it's real. Clara looked at the simple, dark band on her hand. It was more beautiful to her than any diamond. It was a symbol of a love not bought or sold, but earned through trust and sacrifice. It was the symbol of her freedom. That freedom took root and began to blossom in unexpected ways. Now that she no longer had to look over her shoulder, Clara began to look outward. She saw the children in the scattered, remote homesteads, especially the ones who were overlooked. There were the 2 young daughters of a freedman named Joseph, who worked a small plot down in the valley, and a handful of Arapaho children from a peaceful camp in the foothills, whose families traded furs in town but were otherwise kept at a distance. These children had no school, no one to teach them their letters or numbers. Clara had been robbed of her own youth, her own education. She decided she would give these children what had been taken from her. She started simply, on the front porch of the cabin, with a few pieces of charcoal and a smoothed plank of wood for a slate. Joseph's girls, Sarah and Phoebe, were her first students. They were shy at first, but their curiosity soon won over. A few weeks later, 2 Arapaho children, a quiet boy named Little Hawk and his fiercely intelligent sister, Singing Bird, joined them. News of Mrs. Thorne's school spread. She taught them to read from an old Bible and a tattered copy of Shakespeare that had been her mother's. She taught them arithmetic by counting cattle and calculating seasons. But more than that, she gave them a place where they were seen and valued, to the girls especially. She was a quiet, powerful role model. She, who had been brutalized and silenced, was now giving them a voice, teaching them that their minds were the one thing no one could ever take from them. Her life settled into a new, peaceful rhythm, marked by the changing seasons and the laughter of children in her yard. The ghosts of New Orleans grew quieter, their whispers fainter. One evening, as the summer sun bled across the horizon, painting the mountains in hues of orange and deep purple, she and Eli sat on the porch steps, watching the last of the light fade. A comfortable silence settled between them.
"Sarah asked me a question today,"
Clara said softly.
"She asked if we had any children of our own."
Eli looked over at her. Her profile was serene in the twilight, the hard lines of fear and sorrow long since softened into a gentle strength. "What did you tell her?"
"I told her, not yet."
She turned to him, a shy, hopeful smile playing on her lips.
"I never thought, for a long time, I didn't think I would ever be fit to be a mother. I thought the things that happened to me had poisoned me, broken something inside that could never be fixed."
Eli reached over and took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it.
"Nothing about you is broken,
Clara." She leaned her head against his shoulder, her gaze on the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "I used to think I was a wound," she whispered, the words a confession of her deepest, most private pain. "A damaged thing that would only bring pain to anyone who touched it." She squeezed his hand. "You showed me I could be the cure." He didn't answer with words. He simply lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture of profound, unspoken agreement in healing herself. She had healed him in finding her own voice. She had given voice to the hopes of others. Later that night, the cabin was quiet except for the familiar sigh of the wind outside. A single candle burned on the small table beside their bed, casting a warm, flickering glow on the log walls. They lay facing each other, the simple leather ring on her finger a dark circle against the white of the cotton sheets. This was the final frontier, the one place her past still held a shadowy claim. The intimacy they had shared in the line shack had been born of desperation and survival. This was different. This was a choice, made in safety and in love. He reached out, his hand gently tracing the line of her jaw. There was no hesitation, no question in his touch, only a deep and patient love. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time he saw no ghosts there, no fear, only the reflection of his own adoration.
"Clara,"
he whispered, his voice thick with all the things that had gone unsaid between them. She leaned into his touch, a silent, willing surrender that was not a defeat, but a victory. This act, which had once been a source of terror and shame, was now being reclaimed, redefined by the love of this good, quiet man. His touch was not one of ownership, but of worship. He kissed the faded bruise on her neck, not to erase it, but to sanctify it, to claim it as part of the geography of the woman he loved. Every scar he had ever seen became a place to be soothed, to be revered. He was healing her with his hands, with his lips, with the sheer force of his unconditional love. And for Clara, it was the final, definitive act of her freedom. In his arms, in their home, she was not Lily, the broken plaything of a cruel man. She was Clara May Stevenson Thorne, a wife, a teacher, a survivor. She was whole. Sometime in the deep of the night, long after Eli had fallen into a peaceful sleep beside her, Clara slipped out of bed. She lit a lantern and sat at the kitchen table, the very same table where she had once laid out the cold, hard terms of her servitude. She pulled out a piece of paper and a pen. She thought of the other girls she had known in that velvet and perfume prison, girls with names like hers, with stories like hers, who were still trapped in the dark. She couldn't know where they were, or if they had even survived, but she could send a message of hope out into the world for those who might come after. She began to write, not to anyone in particular, but to a Quaker-run society in Philadelphia she had read about, one that helped women in distress. "To whom it may concern," she wrote, her hand now steady and sure. "My name is Clara Thorne. I am writing to you from Wyoming Territory. For 2 years of my life, I was held in a house in New Orleans against my will. I was not called by my own name, and I was not the master of my own body. I believed that my life was over, that the person I had once been was dead and buried." She told her story, not the brutal details, but the story of her escape, her journey north, and the advertisement for a mail-order bride that had been her lifeline. She wrote of a quiet, honorable man who had offered her a home and had stood against the law itself to protect her. She wrote of a judge who believed in the Constitution more than he believed in a rich man's bill of sale. I am writing this letter so that you may tell my story to others who are still in the dark. Tell them that hope is not a foolish thing. Tell them that there is goodness in this world, sometimes in the most unexpected and remote of places. Tell them that a person is not defined by the wounds they have been given, but by the strength they find to heal. Tell them that freedom is real. She signed her name, folded the paper, and slid it into an envelope. She would send it with Silas on his next trip east. It was a single candle, pushed out into an ocean of darkness, but it was lit by the brilliant, unquenchable flame of her own survival. A year passed. Spring returned to the high meadows, not with the false promise of the previous year, but with a deep, life-affirming certainty. The snows melted, feeding the creeks until they ran full and boisterous, and the land awoke, clothing itself in a vibrant, verdant green. On the small, lonely knoll behind the cabin, where a simple wooden cross marked Martha's grave, the grass grew thick and soft. Clara often went there in the quiet of the morning, not with a sense of trespassing on a past that wasn't hers, but with a gentle reverence. Eli had lost a love here. She understood loss. She would clear the wild tendrils of vine from the marker and place a small, humble bouquet of wildflowers at its base: purple lupine, scarlet gilia, the sunny yellow of the arrowleaf balsam root. It was a gesture of peace, a quiet acknowledgement of the woman whose memory was woven into the fabric of this land and into the heart of the man she loved. Eli would watch her from the porch, a lump in his throat. He felt no conflict, no tearing of loyalties. He felt only a profound sense of peace, as if Clara's gentle hands were healing not only his present, but his past as well. This spring was different. There was a new softness to Clara's movements, a serene, inward-looking glow on her face. She tired more easily, and in the evenings, she would rest her hand on her abdomen with a look of quiet wonder. One afternoon, as they walked back from Martha's grave, the sun warm on their faces, she stopped and took his large, calloused hand, placing it on the gentle swell of her stomach. His hand was rough, but his touch was feather-light. Beneath his palm, he felt a faint, delicate flutter, a flicker of new life. His breath caught. He looked from his hand to her face, his eyes wide with a question he barely dared to ask. She answered it with a slow, radiant smile that transformed her entire being. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated joy, a sight more beautiful than any sunrise he had ever witnessed over the mountains. He knelt in the soft grass before her, his rough-hewn exterior crumbling to reveal the raw, tender heart of the man beneath. He pressed his forehead gently against her, against the new life they had created, and a single, hot tear escaped his eye, tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. He had never expected this. After Martha, he had resigned himself to a life of solitude, of emptiness. He had asked for a woman who could work. God had sent him a miracle. News of the pregnancy traveled through solitude with the speed of a prairie fire, but the whispers that followed them now were not the venomous, judgmental hisses of the past. The town that had once been so quick to condemn her now saw her through new eyes. The story of the trial in the saloon had become local legend. The quiet homesteader who had faced down a wealthy city slicker. The mail-order bride who was not a runaway thief but a survivor of incredible courage. She was no longer just Thorne's wife. In the hushed, respectful tones of the townspeople, she had earned a new name, Courageous Clara. The change was most apparent in Agnes Miller. One day, as Clara was leaving the general store, the older woman bustled out after her, her face a mask of flustered determination. She thrust a bolt of soft, yellow flannel into Clara's arms.
"For the baby,"
Agnes mumbled, refusing to meet her eyes.
"Every child deserves a soft blanket. It's the Christian thing to do."
It was as close to an apology as the woman was capable of, and Clara accepted it with a grace that left Agnes speechless. The final ghost of her past was exorcised by a letter that arrived with Silas in the late summer. It was not from a lawyer or a sheriff, but from the Quaker Society in Philadelphia to which she had sent her story. She opened it with trembling hands, Eli reading over her shoulder. The letter was penned by a woman named Sarah Jenkins, the Society's secretary. She wrote that Clara's testimony, detailed and unflinching, had been the key they had needed. They had presented it to federal marshals who were already investigating whispers of trafficking rings operating on the Mississippi. Clara's story provided names, locations, and a first-hand account that could not be dismissed. An investigation was launched in New Orleans. Sarah Jenkins wrote, "The house you spoke of has been shuttered. The woman who ran it is in federal custody, and a man by the name of Martin Beauclair, along with several of his associates, was arrested last month for the crimes of kidnapping and involuntary servitude. They will not harm anyone ever again. Several other young women were found and have been brought to our society for care and resettlement. Your letter, Mrs. Thorne, was a candle in the dark. You may never know the lives you have saved, but we do. Your courage has brought justice. May you find the peace you so richly deserve." Clara read the letter 3 times, the words blurring through her tears. It was done. The chains were not just broken, they were obliterated. The men who had built her prison were now in prisons of their own. She looked up at Eli, her face wet, but her eyes shining with a fierce, brilliant light. The final weight had been lifted from her soul. That night, they sat on the porch, the letter resting on the small table between them. The air was cool, hinting at the coming autumn, and the sky was a blanket of impossible stars. They spoke of the future, a future that was now truly, wholly their own, unburdened by the threat of the past. "We should think of a name," Eli said softly, his hand resting on her belly, where their child now kicked with a steady, reassuring strength. Clara was quiet for a long moment, her gaze lost in the star-dusted heavens. She thought of her long walk from New Orleans, of the desperation that had been her only companion. She thought of the tattered advertisement in the post office, a tiny flicker of possibility in a world of despair. She thought of this man, this land, this life that had been born from the ashes of her old one. "Hope," she whispered. "I would like to name her Hope." Eli's throat tightened. He looked at his wife, her face illuminated by the starlight, and he knew there was no other name in the world that could possibly be more perfect. The story ends here, but it also begins here. It ends on a high, wind-swept bluff, the same one where they had spoken their vows. It is a year later, in the full bloom of spring. Clara, heavy with child, stands beside Eli, their hands intertwined. They look down upon their valley, their small kingdom carved from the wilderness. The cabin sends a thin, welcoming curl of smoke into the crisp air. The cattle graze peacefully in the green pasture. It is a picture of profound peace. The land that had once been a symbol of Eli's loneliness and Clara's desperate search for sanctuary was now a testament to their shared resilience. It was a place where wounds had been healed, where courage had been forged, and where a new life was about to begin. Eli looked at Clara, He saw the mother of his child, the teacher of the forgotten, the woman who had faced down her demons and won. He saw the quiet strength that had been there all along, buried but never extinguished. He thought of his advertisement, his simple request for a wife who was willing to work. He had believed he was offering a rescue, a safe harbor for a woman in need. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile of a man who has been blessed beyond all measure. He finally understood the truth.
She never needed anyone to save her, he thought,
his heart overflowing with a love so vast it seemed to fill the entire sky.
But I know that I was saved by her.
Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to hear from you in the comments below. Let us know where in the world you're listening from. Please consider subscribing to our channel, From Wild West, for more tales like this one. And don't forget to share your thoughts on Eli and Clara's journey.